Great. Okay. As Richard has already indicated, sphagnum is a rather useful little plant. We here consider this to be probably the most important plant in the world. It's a natural sequester of CO2, which not only sequesters the CO2, it keeps it permanently stored in peat bogs as peat, as Richard ably described. So it's far superior to growing trees, because trees tend to die, rot, and then release the CO2. Whereas peat bogs, provided people don't come along and damage them, hold that carbon on a permanent basis. One of the problems there is that actually people have come along and damaged rather a lot of peat bogs. And what we're doing as a company is to try and produce some sphagnum to try and restore some of these. So sphagnum has significant uses, and we're producing it for restoring peat bogs. England's target, recently announced by the government, is to restore over 35,000 hectares in the next 5 years, which is wonderful. There are an awful lot more than 35,000 hectares that need restoring, but it's a good start. The other very good use for peat, for sphagnum, would be to replace peat use in horticulture and gardening. There's huge amounts of peat dug up at the moment, which are used for growing plants. As a member of the horticulture industry, I will admit that we're guilty of doing that in the past, but we have now moved away from that, and we're using sphagnum as a growing medium. There's something like 30 million cubic meters a year grown in of peat harvested for growing plants in Europe. That's 30 million cubic meters. It's a number that's almost impossible to imagine, but it's a big heap of peat. We've developed a technique for micro-propagating sphagnum in a sustainable way. In fact, we're the only people in the world starting to produce sphagnum by micro-propagation, and therefore not damaging peat bogs by taking it from a peat bog and then trying to restore another peat bog. That doesn't strike me as very sensible. We've been working on this since 2005, so we have a little bit of expertise in that. Okay. So, to restore peat bogs, we need sphagnum on a vast scale, and that's what we're trying to produce. We grow small hummocks of sphagnum in our glass houses, which has been micro-propagated and then it's planted into little plugs. We can grow that from tiny little fragments of sphagnum. We don't need to go back to peat bogs to obtain more material. We can just keep growing it once we've got it established. We grow lots and lots of different species. We tend to grow mixed species so that the correct species will establish in the right area. In the last 12 months, we've produced over 3 million of these little hummocks for planting and restoration. Just to give you an idea of how sphagnum grows, it can be slow growing. In the sort of embryonic bog situation, it grows really quite slowly, but the micro-propagated hummocks that we plant into areas that are damaged, there's quite often quite a lot of nutrients available for the sphagnum, and it will grow quite quickly. This is a slide of a picture of a trial being done by Moors for the Future, where they planted hummocks in 2015, 2% cover. By 2018, they got a 97% cover, which is pretty good. We've also worked on lowland bogs. The previous picture is upland in the middle of Britain. This is lowland peat bog, one that was actually cut for peat for horticultural use. and needed restoration. And we planted some hummocks there, and in approximately 2 years we were getting a complete cover of sphagnum. So the other possibility for sphagnum is to farm it. As Andy's already mentioned, it can be farmed for carbon, which basically means growing sphagnum and leaving it where it is to be preserved as peat hidden below the sphagnum, and provided the surface is intact, it'll stay there. But the other alternative use is to farm it as a crop, and then crop it, harvest it, and then use it for growing media. So for horticultural use, for growing plants in. And Jack will talk about this a little bit later. Interestingly now, the government, the UK, is committed to stop peat use in horticulture totally by 2030. So we've got about 10 years to replace millions of cubic meters of peat with something else. And that is concentrating a few minds and realizing that sphagnum actually has the potential to replace this peat, because actually peat is sphagnum, it's just compressed. There is a myth, and I consider it to be a myth, that sphagnum only grows very slowly. This I think is completely untrue, particularly if you look after it and grow it well, and farmers are quite good at doing that. So I just wanted to show you, I've got a few real sphagnum plants here, so I'm going to unshare my screen and show you a few real bits of sphagnum. So this is sphagnum, and this is a piece of sphagnum that's 2 years old. So it grows very slowly, doesn't it? Admittedly, we have looked after this quite well in our glass house, but it grows quickly if you look after it. The process for producing it for growing media is to then dry it. So by this stage it's looking rather like hay. And again, this is some of the 2-year-old stuff. It's only little, of course. And the next process is, once the material is then chopped up into tiny little fragments, and that basically is much the same as peat. It's slightly lighter in colour, but has all the same properties as peat, although slightly better for growing plants. Most horticulturists think this is wonderful because it holds more air and more water than peat. If you mix it up with something like bark, composted bark, you get a nice growing media that's ideal for growing all sorts of plants. So that's what we're aiming to produce lots of. Okay. The only other thing I've got to get sphagnum everywhere here now, is to ask you all a question, which we will hopefully answer at the end of the session. But I have here a small cube of sphagnum. It's 20 centimeters in each dimension, and the question is, how much CO2 is in there? If I just share my screen again, I'll okay, so how much carbon dioxide in volume do you think is sequestered in this cube of sphagnum?